Ever since the first little blip on an oscilloscope let some researchers play virtual tennis, video games have been a big part of our lives. As the medium developed into more complex graphics, sounds, and controls, more and more people found themselves entertained by a plethora of available options. One of the biggest genres of video games has, and likely always will be, science fiction. If you look back at some of the earliest games to be commercially developed, you'll find classic hits like Asteroids, Space Invaders, and Tempest, all of which are sci-fi and well-known classics to boot. The genre continued to develop as video games became more advanced, and these days everything from turn-based strategy to first-person shooters incorporates sci-fi elements. Because of this, there are thousands of sci-fi video games that have been developed over the years, and that means there's a library of games you've likely never played. It could be due to the fact that some sci-fi classics came and went before you ever touched a video game, or they were drowned out by other options when they were released. Whatever the reason, there are some amazing sci-fi video games many people never got a chance to play. I am Kirsten from WhatCulture Gaming, and these are 10 best sci-fi video games you've never played. Number 10, Vanquish, 2009. Vanquish was released in 2009 for the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 to considerable critical approval. The game was developed as a third-person shooter, but it incorporates elements of beat-em-ups, 2D bullet hell shooters, and it introduced an innovative sliding boost mechanic, which has since been copied into many other games. This is just one of those titles that just didn't get the kind of attention other AAA games got when it was released. It was an entirely new franchise, so there wasn't a ton of people lining up to buy a copy like they might have done for the latest Call of Duty effort, making it one that a lot of people missed out on. Of course, the fact that it was released on the same day as Fallout New Vegas didn't help its sales either. While too few people enjoyed Vanquish when it was released, those who did play it found it to be a complex and entertaining game. It did suffer from a campaign that was far too short, but other than that, the mechanics, gameplay, setting, themes, soundtrack, and graphics were all praised. Because Vanquish brought innovative new mechanics to the third-person shooter genre, it should definitely be checked out by anyone who loves playing these types of games. All games that followed with a sliding mechanic owe a debt of thanks to Vanquish, and fortunately it's been given a Game of the Year edition and a PC port, so it's still available to play. Number 9, Enslaved, Odyssey to the West, 2010. Enslaved, Odyssey to the West was developed from a 16th century Chinese novel titled Journey to the West. Though it incorporates elements of a post-apocalyptic landscape, so it is a fairly loose adaptation that relies heavily on the novel's themes more than anything. It's set 150 years in the future following a global war, and most of humanity is long gone. Enslaved is strange in a lot of ways, but that only serves to make it more entertaining. The odd setting and ridiculously well-voiced characters given life by actors like Andy Serkis give Enslaved Odyssey to the West a cinematic feel, as if you're not playing a video game so much as taking part in a movie. The player takes control of a guy named Monkey, who must escort Trip home after they survive a ship crash. When it first entered development, it was planned as a CGI film, but it went to video game territory as time went on, though the cinematic qualities remained. Sadly, Enslaved Odyssey to the West was a commercial failure, and there's a good chance you've never played it as a result. Despite not selling many copies when it was released, it was a critical success, and the few people lucky enough to stumble upon it continue to sing its praises. Number 8, ANACHRONOX, 2001. ANACHRONOX is a 2001 third-person role-playing game that revolves around a massive story campaign blended with humor, action, and sci-fi. It incorporates numerous subgenres including cyberpunk and film noir, but it's probably best known for not taking itself too seriously, which involves a lot of humor spread throughout the game. Gameplay is centered around Sylvester Sly Boots Buccelli, who works in the slums of ANACHRONOX, which is an abandoned planet located near the galaxy's Jumpgate hub. Players can travel to other planets, build up a gathering of allies, and solve a mystery that threatens the fate of the entire universe. ANACHRONOX was heavily inspired by others in the genre, including the Final Fantasy franchise and Chrono Trigger. It was also inspired by the animation style of Chuck Jones, so the visual elements are about as entertaining as any other part, and it uses a huge color palette with expressive camera, lighting, and particle effects. It was a bit ahead of its time when it came out, but for some reason it didn't sell well at all. It was a financial flop despite being loved by the few people who bothered to pick up a copy. There were plans to develop a sequel, but it was scrapped, and the developer Ion Storm closed a few days after it was released. Number 7, WIPEOUT 2048, 2012. The WIPEOUT franchise has been around since 1995. Since then, 8 sequels were released, and WIPEOUT 2048 is easily the best and most recent title in the series. WIPEOUT 2048 is just like the ones that came before it, as it's a racing game where players take control of an anti-gravity ship that they can cruise along almost any surface, no matter if it's on the ceiling, wall, or floor. It's a fun and exciting racing game, but hardly anyone played it when it was released. There's really just one reason for that. Do you own a PlayStation Vita? Probably not, since the console was a commercial failure. People don't play handheld consoles nearly as much anymore, thanks to the increasing playability of games on mobile phones, so there's a good chance that you never touched a PS Vita and missed out on playing WIPEOUT 2048. Which is unfortunate because despite being released exclusively on that platform, WIPEOUT 2048 is an incredibly well-designed game. The graphics and controls are exceptional, and even though it's a handheld console with ridiculously long loading times, it's one of those games that you can just sit down and play for hours at a time. Fortunately, you can play it even if you don't have a PS Vita. WIPEOUT 2048 was included in the WIPEOUT Omega collection, which was released on the PlayStation 4 in 2017. Number 6, Child of Eden, 2011. Child of Eden is a 2011 rail shooter released for the Xbox 360. It was one of the first titles to incorporate the use of the Kinect camera, but it fortunately doesn't require it for the gameplay. The title was developed as a spiritual successor to Res, and it introduced unique mechanics. Players take control of a ship flying through Eden, which is a new form of the internet spanning the entire universe. Your job? Eliminate viruses to protect a digitized version of Lumi, the first human born in space. Every level in the game is highly stylized and varied. There are ocean levels, not water levels, so don't worry, and levels that look like gardens, while others offer up scenes filled with clouds, space, and other sci-fi settings. Children of Eden is specially designed as an experiment with synesthesia, which is the perceptual phenomenon some people have that lets them see numbers as colours. Colour and sound are the two main features of the game, and jumping into the world of Child of Eden is like stepping into a virtual painting. It's a beautiful, engrossing, and innovative experience that you're not going to find in any other rail shooter. Number 5, Marathon, 1994. Many years before Bungie would become synonymous with AAA titles like Halo, the developer released a first-person shooter that was way ahead of its time. Marathon was released in 1994 for the Apple Macintosh, and it was a game-changer, thanks to the introduction of several elements now common in first-person shooters. The gameplay is set hundreds of years into the future aboard a colony ship called Marathon. The player is a security officer who must defend the ship and all of its inhabitants from an alien invasion intent on their destruction. The storyline was well-developed and a major element of gameplay. Most first-person shooters from the early 90s didn't put as much emphasis on the story as much as Marathon. Doom, for instance, had almost no storyline and was entirely focused on action, but Marathon flipped the script and stood apart from the competition by being innovative in this area. It also featured a deathmatch mode allowing 8 players to kill one another at once, which was a lot in those days. Marathon is the first in a trilogy and has since been released as freeware by Bungie, so you can still play it. It's one of these titles that may not look good compared to modern FPSs, but diving into this intricately detailed lore keeps it highly entertaining, so it warrants your attention. Number 4, AXIOM VERGE, 2015. AXIOM VERGE is an interesting title for a number of reasons, but most importantly, it was developed entirely by one person. Thomas Happ developed it as a passion project, which took him 5 years to complete and release. AXIOM VERGE is something of a love letter to Metroid and shares numerous elements with the NES classic. The game is a side-scroller action-adventure which puts players in control of Trace, a scientist who suffers a serious injury and wakes up in an ancient, high-tech world unlike his own. Metroid's influence is clear, but it also shares many things in common with Contra, Bionic Commando, and Blaster Master. When it was released, AXIOM VERGE received a great deal of attention due in large part to the fact that Happ did everything on his own, including the artwork, music, and coding. Unfortunately, because it is technically an independent game, it didn't receive as much attention as it would have were it released for the NES in the 80s. When it was being developed for release, it was expected to come out on the PC and Xbox 360, but due to delay, that couldn't happen as expected, and some players missed out. Eventually, it was released for every platform out there, so you can still play, which is a good thing as this is easily one of the best sci-fi 2D side-scrollers released in the last 25 years. Number 3, Descent, 1995. First-person shooters were some of the most successful games in the 1990s, and while that hasn't exactly changed with modern AAA titles, most modern FPSs tend to share a lot of the same mechanics. 1995's Descent was a first-person shooter, but it redefined how those games were played by enhancing just about everything. Descent was the first true 3D first-person shooter, and the graphics were exceptionally well done when compared to the flat 2D games that came before it. Players took control of a spaceship, which they flew into an off-world mining facility to destroy dangerous robots infected by an alien computer virus. Instead of running through levels and shooting everything that moved, Descent put the player into a 3D landscape, which they could fly through as if it were a spaceflight simulator. This meant that you could fly up into passages through the ceiling or down through the shafts in the floor, making the entire level your playground with no limitations. While you can fire up the old version via an emulator, you don't necessarily have to do this any longer. A successful Kickstarter campaign is bringing the game back in a big way. A new title, which will simply be called Descent, is expected to release on PC and all major game consoles. Technically, it's an entirely new game, which serves as a prequel to the series and will introduce its innovative and unique mechanics to a new generation of gamers. Number 2, Shadowrun, 1993. Dungeons & Dragons essentially established pen and paper role-playing games as a viable means of jumping into a world and playing an imaginative story, but it was only the beginning of the genre. Shadowrun entered the RPG arena in 1989 as a science fiction RPG, and it was incredibly popular. Eventually, it was adapted into video games and other media, with the 1993 title for the Super Nintendo system being the best adaptation of Shadowrun made to date. This is one of those games that was played heavily when it first came out, but seeing as it's more than 25 years old, the current generation of gamers likely missed out. Shadowrun was based on a novel titled Never Deal with a Dragon by Robert N. Charette, who co-created the original tabletop RPG. It is set in the year 2050, and players take on the role of Jake Armitage, an amnesiac who was seriously injured and must learn who wants him dead. It wasn't a commercial success when it came out, as many games that were critically praised didn't necessarily sell well. Despite this, Shadowrun has been beloved for years by anyone who played it when it was released. Fortunately, it gained new life in 2013 with a successful Kickstarter campaign for a re-release/sequel/tie-in titled Shadowrun Returns, so it can be enjoyed with a modern update on the PC, Mac, iOS, and Android. Number 1, Dune 2, The Building of a Dynasty, 1992. Dune 2, The Building of a Dynasty, was released back in 1992, so there's a good chance most gamers who enjoy real-time strategy games never played it. For those older gamers who found it when it came out, Dune 2 was something of a game changer. While it wasn't the first real-time strategy game ever made, it was an early example that completely revolutionized how RTSs were played. Its influence can be seen in pretty much every franchise in the genre that followed it, including Command & Conquer, Warcraft, and StarCrate, just to name a few. Dune 2 was loosely based on David Lynch's 1984 film adaptation of Frank Herbert's book, and it incorporates elements of both. If you were a fan of Dune in any format, there was a good chance that you played this game, as it included sandworms, the harvesting of spice, and other thematic elements from the franchise. Being an archetypal RTS, Dune 2 introduced several elements to the genre that didn't exist before, but are now ubiquitous. These include resource gathering to fund construction, base and unit construction, a world map for mission selection, a technology tree for building and improving units, the deployment of mobile units and construction elements, multiple faction options, and the ability to issue commands with a mouse. And there we go, those are the 10 best sci-fi video games you probably haven't played, but if you have and you did enjoy them, then leave us a comment down below. Speaking of enjoyment, if you did enjoy this video, give it a like, and if you haven't already, click that subscribe button. But for now, I have been Kirsten from WhatCulture Gaming, and I will see you in the next video.